some research topics that interest me a lot and have been interesting me for a while now. So I'm very happy to connect with people I know and also new people that are also interested in these topics. And also very happy to look at these topics of policy transfer and mobilities from the perspective of the Global South, which I think has not been done so well or so often. And so I'm very excited to be here. So today I'll be speaking about a paper that has been published for a while, actually, since 2018, but it was only officially published in Urban Studies this year. And it's called Leveraging Bogota, Sustainable Development, Global Philanthropy, and the Rise of Urban Solutionism. And this research is very much related to my old research that I've been doing for the last, I don't know, almost 10 years now, about the construction and circulation of Bogota as a model. But I also want to finish, I will finish this presentation talking a little bit about future research directions, research questions that I am considering now that are related to this project, but also slightly different, but still related with the idea of policy mobilities and transfer, and is very much related with this idea of how in Latin America we can move beyond progressive laws and progressive constitutions and then actually enact them. And in that way, I don't know if there are Chileans in the audience, but if they are, I want to congratulate them on their new constitution, which made me very happy yesterday. Okay, so I'll go on. So this is the article that I was telling you about. I'm happy to send it to you, but it's now already published in Urban Studies. And it's part of a special issue that is also very interesting. It's called, Why Does Everyone Think Cities Can Save the Planet? Takes on this question on why cities seems to be now the solution for, it used to be that cities were conceived as problems, especially for climate change and environmental issues. But now it seems to be like since the last years that they're also proposed as solutions. But I think that it's important to problematize this idea of cities as solutions. So my paper is one take on this, but there are other papers in the special issue that you might be interested as well. Okay, so let me explain a little bit for those of you that might have not heard about Bogota. Although it would be weird because it's been all over the media for the last 10 years. But for those of you that haven't heard about it, so what sort of draws my attention to this research project was how Bogota changed its narrative, right? Or the narrative that was circulating globally. Traditionally portrayed as an urban dystopia, as a city of fear. Many of the images, the global images that were coming from Bogota in the 90s were images of drug trafficking, of Pablo Escobar. If you've seen that Netflix show Narcos, that was kind of the narrative of Bogota and Colombia in the 90s. And then what we start to see in the 2000s is the emergence of a new narrative, particularly in urban planning. So Bogota starts to circulate as this city that has changed their transport network, that has implemented this Transmilenio, this bus rapid transit system, which for those of you that have not heard about this before, is Bogota's bus system. It's sometimes called a metro on surface. They're basically buses, but the thing is that they have the stations in the center of the roads, and you pay before entering the bus. And so this makes buses run way faster. This is not an idea originally from Bogota. It was first experimented in Curitiba in Brazil in the 70s. But then Bogota implemented BRT and still is the biggest BRT system in the world. And then the other policy that has become part of this new global imaginary or this new global narrative about Bogota is Ciclovia, which is this program that takes place in Bogota every Sunday and holiday. About 1 million people, Bogotanos, take part in this program every Sunday. So that's quite a lot. If you imagine the population of Amsterdam is almost that. So every Sunday, the same population of Amsterdam is on bikes in Bogota every Sunday. So this policy has also become very popular and has started to circulate a lot in recent years. So some examples here to illustrate these replications or these circulations of Bogota. So here we have an image of Guangzhou in China, a BRT system based on Bogota's Transmilenio that then became also an example for many cities in China. So that it was very interesting. I didn't write about this story, but this is also very interesting how BRT arrives to Guangzhou and then Guangzhou becomes sort of like the replicating city for many, many cities in China that have built a BRT in the last years. Here we have a photo of the BRT in Johannesburg in South Africa, also based on Bogota's Transmilenio, Mexico City. Also some cities in the US have referenced Bogota, which is also part of my interest. And then the Ciclovia program. So we have here the Bogota program, but we have the one in Guadalajara in Mexico, which is the second one in the world right now, about 250,000 people every Sunday. We have the capital of car culture, Los Angeles, also referencing Bogota to do a Ciclovia program. They don't do it weekly. They only do it like twice or 3 times a year. But it's interesting that the name, they keep the name and the reference to Bogota. San Francisco, that's Sunday streets. On Bogota. And many other cities have referenced Bogota. And I bring this image is interesting to me because this is actually Jakarta in Indonesia, but it looks pretty much like Bogota in the sense that their BRT system is called Transjakarta. It's almost a copy of Bogota Transmilenio. And then they also have the Sunday Ciclovia. So all that to show, let me show you now some data. So here we have the number of cities that have built a BRT system. So as I said, Bogota was not the first one. It started in Curitiba in 1974, but it's after Bogota does it in the late 90s and early 2000s that there's like this explosion of BRT systems in the world. Same happens with the Ciclovia programs. Ciclovia, these like Sunday bike programs are not a new thing. They've been happening in many cities since the 60s and 70s. In Bogota, it's been happening since 74. But it's also after 2000 that this boom started, right? So that was part of like my interest, my research interest in this. There was like different paradoxes that I was interested in this. One was, why now? And by now, I mean since the early 2000s. Why, if these were so interesting policies, why did they happen? Or why did they start to circulate so widely in the early 2000s and not before? That was one of the key research interests that I had. The other paradox that I saw that I was also interested is in how was it possible that a policy from the South was traveling not only south-south, but also south-north. No? So some cities in Europe and some cities in the US were referencing Bogota. So I was very interested because the traditional colonial legacy of urban planning knowledge circulation was north to south. So what was happening here, not so new, but was like covered under this idea of south-south and south-north. That was another thing that interested me. And the other thing that interested me is that many changes have happened in Bogota in the 90s, but only this set of transportation policies were the ones that were traveling. So the other sort of like decentralization, democratization, and fiscal policies that allow for the democratization of public expenses, the decentralization of planning, the new Colombian constitution that is from 1991. I mean, there's a lot of sort of like political economy changes that happen in Bogota and in Colombia that allowed for cities to have more money to do something like Transmilenio, which costed a lot of money. Those things, those fiscal policies, those decentralization policies, those were not traveling as part of this narrative, but it was also only sort of like the nicely packaged transportation best practices. So that was also a thing that I was very interested in this research. So I've published a lot about these issues, sort of like asking different questions about this circulation of Bogota. But today I want to, and if you're interested, I have here some references. But if you're, but today I'll be talking specifically about this article that, to me, answers the question of why now, of these different questions that I've been talking before. In this article, I was much more concerned not about the how question, which are also very important in policy mobilities, right? So how cities learn, how the role of study tours, conferences, experts, no? Those are questions that have interested me a lot too. But in this article, I was more interested in the why question. Why now, and why Bogota, but also why now? And so this why question also tells me something about the current moment, the current historical conjuncture that makes Bogota circulates since the early 2000s and not before. But why is that, right? So, and here I want to share something with you, which is this graph that is, I think, is part of the article, which is the number of study tours. I'm sure a lot of you know what study tours are, but if not, I'll briefly describe them. But the study tours are this policy learning mechanism that cities use to learn from each other. So normally they send a delegation of, I don't know, normally it's like between 5 or 10 people. And normally these are important people in a city, like the mayor or like some important person from planning. Some people that go to other city to learn about something, and then they come back and try to do it in their home city. So these are very important policy learning mechanisms that are happening, and that happen in Bogota, that are part of the story of how the Bogota model spread around the world. So here we have a list of the different countries that went to that sent city delegations to Bogota to learn from Bogota. So if you see this list of countries, what thing comes to your mind? You can activate your microphone to say something. But what do you see in this list of the cities and countries that learned from Bogota? Anyone?
Sergio, this is David. Sergio, this is David.
Yeah.
Lopez. So it's basically south to south, right? With a few exceptions like the United States or South or Korea or Spain or Sweden, but basically south to south.
Right, exactly.
Circulation.
Exactly.
Right?
That's what I did. I did this like database with the Transmilenio archives, and when I finally made this, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this sort of like confirms that Bogota has been traveling south to south. But then I want to share with you this quote from an interview that I did with the guy that organizes study tours in Transmilenio. So Transmilenio became so popular that the bus company, had to hire one person that his work was to basically welcome delegations to Bogota and show them around. He told me that there were like about 2 to 3 delegations per week coming to Bogota. So this was his full-time job. But he was a very interesting person for me to interview because he knew everyone that was coming to Bogota and sort of like the logics behind it. And so I asked them about, among many other things, but I asked him, so for a week, pay hotels, pay dinners, pay transportation. So who pays for this? And that's literally what he said. He said, the entities that have brought more delegations to Bogota are 2 NGOs. One is called ITDP and the other is Embark, which is based in Washington, DC and is funded by Shell Foundation. Other entities that have brought delegations are the World Bank and the Colombian Ministry of Transport, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Asian Development Bank have also brought delegations. And also bus manufacturers such as Volvo or Mercedes. So if we combine this data with this quote, I think it tells you a very interesting story that, yes, Bogota has traveled south to south, but also the main nodes of funding for the circulations of Bogota are in the north. And not only are in the north, but are also development entities, right? So it's the apparatus of international development, the development banks and global philanthropy. And yes, there's also Volvo and Mercedes, which is also a story that have been told about Bogota, how, you know, how the trips of Peñalosa and the trips of Bogota, this is like being funded by Volvo buses. And that's part of the story. But if you see this, and if you look at the funding scheme, most of the funding scheme has not to pay for the travels to Bogota or for the travels of Peñalosa mayors to other cities of the world. Is not coming from Volvo or Mercedes, it's actually coming from the apparatus of international development. So that's what I became very interested in understanding, how the circulation of Bogota and the circulation of urban best practices was connected to something that was happening in international development. And that's basically what this paper is about, like how the circulation of Bogota really, since the early 2000s, really tell us something about the international development apparatus. So, and I want to highlight, in that paper, what I do is I highlight 3 shifts or 3 key changes that have happened in the international development apparatus that I think are interesting, are related with some of the questions that are going to be posed in this seminar. The first question or the first issue is there's a new political economy of international development that has been happening for a while. And that means that there's more heterogeneity and more actors funding development. So it used to be that the countries of the North used to give some percentage of their GDP, you know, the long discussions in the 90s about giving 0.7% of the GDP to development work. So there's for a long time, development was funded mostly by countries in the North. But we're seeing how these sources are rapidly diversifying. So now we have more importance of other sources of development. One is remittances from migrants. That's been increasing a lot in the last years. And the other is private investment. But the other, and the one that is, I think, less talked about, and was the one that I was more interested in, is philanthropic funding. And here we have a graph. It's only until 2010, unfortunately, the yellow line that is growing, philanthropic funding. But if you see this other graph that I have here on the right of the US total economic engagement with developing countries, we see that in 2011, philanthropic funding is already higher than the US official development assistance. And I think that I don't have figures from the last year. I think I have, I have this one. So if that was 2010, what has happened is that the financial crisis, and in the last 10 years, I think, well, inequality has increased. But when inequality increases, the top 1% are basically the billionaires that are the owners of philanthropy. So what has happened is that in the last 10 years of crisis and inequality, the billionaires of the world have invested more in philanthropy. So philanthropy has more money than ever, and more money in the history of development. And also a lot of new philanthropists, right? So we have Silicon Valley has been producing a lot of new philanthropy. So all these tech companies that now want this, with leaders that now want to change the world, like Bill Gates, Zuckerberg, no? They dedicate a lot of money to philanthropy, and that's impacted a lot how development is funded. And I will elaborate on this more, why this is important, because it's not just about the money, right? It's not that philanthropy has more money now. It's that the way that philanthropy operates is also influencing the way that development operates. And that's the question, that's the argument that I want to make now, because what we see is these guys, Bill Gates, and I give you an example. The World Health Organization, the funding of the World Health Organization right now, the biggest donor is the Gates Foundation. So a lot of big organizations are now funded by philanthropy, and this means that these guys get to be on the decision tables of how development works, how development happens, and what kind of priorities have to be sent. So that is problematic for a number of reasons, because we have basically the billionaires of the world now deciding on what should be done on development. Now, that's not to say that before it used to be like perfect, because then what we used to have before was like big countries of the North deciding for the South, right? But now we have this other thing happening at the same time. And I interview, as part of my research on BRTs, I interview an officer from the Hewlett Foundation, because the Hewlett Foundation has been a big promoter of BRTs around the world, particularly in Mexico and China. So because one of my case studies was Guadalajara in Mexico, so how Guadalajara was implementing BRT. And I was very intrigued as how the Hewlett Foundation, which is based in Silicon Valley, was interested in funding BRTs in Mexico and China. So I went there and I interviewed them, and that's a quote from an interview that I think is also very telling. And she told me, we have a theory of change, and in that theory, we need to have a technology or a best practice that can be implemented and is replicable. We're interested in BRT because we're interested in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. So here we have, I think this is very telling, this quote tells you about the logic of philanthropy, how they need to find something that is quick, that is replicable, that can be implemented in many places at the same time. And that's the kind of thing that they're going to be interested in promoting. Why? Because this is the kind of thing that they can measure very easily, and that then at the annual Christmas dinner, they can all toast to champagne to say, here's for what we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And also she told me that they were interested in Mexican cities and Chinese cities because they were the most polluted ones. And those were the ones that with a small intervention can have a bigger impact, right? So, I mean, that's not bad. It's not that I'm saying that that is bad. I'm just saying that that is the logic through which they operate. And that is the logic that privileges a specific and very a scalable, a replicable measure. And that's why the idea of best practice becomes so important and so interesting for them, and therefore for the world. And here's another image that I have, and this is the image that I think I start the article with this quote. If you're interested in development, you might have read this book called Imperial Nature, where sociologist Michael Goldman talks about how the World Bank has become a knowledge bank, how the power of the bank of the World Bank and development banks in general is not so much about the money that they invest through credits, but it's about how they become the knowledge bank, how they become the experts of development. And so here I have a quote that I took in January 2014 during my fieldwork in Washington, D.C. This was a meeting that takes place every January in Washington, D.C. It's called Transforming Transportation. It's one of the most important meetings for the transportation experts around the world. And it's a meeting that is organized by what was then called EMBARC, which is now called the World Resources Institute, WRI, and the World Bank. It's a joint meeting organized by basically Global Philanthropy and the World Bank. And here, for the first time, they were able to sit down the president of the World Bank at the time. And here's what the president of the World Bank said about the World Bank at the time. Our role is to bring knowledge and experience. So we would sit down and say, here are 50 innovations in other cities across the world. We think giving all this information, a good strategy for you might be this. So we've been called a knowledge bank, and I've been referring to the bank that we need to take the next step and be the solutions bank. And so that was very interesting to me, because that was partly based on what this idea of solutionism that I was thinking about. And let me see. And so what we see is how the World Bank has been actually using Bogota as a solution for transport for the last 10 years. And so we see Bogota used widely in reports about transportation and around the world. But I wanted to highlight a third aspect. So we've seen the first aspect has been the increasing number of actors and the higher heterogeneity of funding and development and the increasing role of philanthropy. The second is this turn in philanthropy and development banks towards solutions. And then the third aspect is the increasing attention to cities as solutions, so the urban solutions, right? So that's also the interesting thing about development. No? Like development banks used to go to negotiate with the national government or ministries, right? So the Ministry of Transport or the Ministry of whatever. So with national level of governments. But what we're seeing also in recent years is an increasing attention to cities as an arenas of intervention for development and for philanthropy. So I have a quote here from Bloomberg Philanthropies that is very interesting to me, and is where I took this idea of the title of this article, like the idea of leveraging Bogota, no? Because here he said, well, climate change is happening, so how do we do it if we have national leaders that do not believe in climate change, like for example, Donald Trump? So it's so difficult to negotiate with national governments. Why don't we just go and talk to mayors, which are more easy to convince and persuade? So what we see here is this example of leveraging cities, no? So he says, here Bloomberg Philanthropy says, Bloomberg leverages the power of cities to create lasting change, especially when national and international bodies refuse to act, no? So here we have this other third aspect of how the idea of leveraging cities to create global changes, right? And I think the image of a leverage is very interesting, no? Like how you use something small to create a big impact. So that is so that leveraging cities logic is, or that I call urban solutionism, is what is becoming more and more present in the last years, both in development banks and in global philanthropy. So what we see here is the reason, and this also—
You have 5 minutes more, Sergio, okay?
Okay, great, yeah, I'm finishing. So what we see here is this graph of Embark, this NGO that was funded by Global Philanthropy, that to me was very telling of this logic, no? So how you measure success is about how many cities, the number of cities that adopt particular best practices or particular instruments that they have identified as best practices that are effective. So what happened with Bogota is that the reason why Bogota started to circulate so widely in the 2000s is because it became one of those best practices identified by these organizations, right? So this is part of the reason of why now and why not before. So some conclusions. So why has become a global model, why Bogota became a global model, is related with this new logic of urban solutionism, right? So this idea that you should identify a quick fix, something that can be easily replicable. But obviously the limits of this is that this is a limited approach because it doesn't take into account the structural factors or other multi-scalar factors that are involved in climate change. So this means that you can be implementing a BRT in your city or a Ciclovia in your city, but at the same time you can also be doing something really polluting in the periphery of the city, for instance. No? So that's the critique of these ideas of urban solutions. One of the other big conclusions of this article is the idea of South-South knowledge, that yes, so Bogota became an example of South-South transfer, but at the same time, as we have seen, this South-South transfer was mediated by the North. So it's important to ask the question of why. So if in my research about how, when you ask how questions, when you follow the actors, sometimes you don't see the money, right? So it's important, I think, in policy transfer and mobilities studies to ask, where does the money come from to pay for all this, right? And that will tell you about, you know, where the North is normally, or at least it did in my research. The other conclusion from this paper is that we need a better articulation between urban and development studies and new forms of relational comparisons. So the necessity for articulation is between urban and development studies, because urban studies has been very much focused on cities of the North, and that's, even though there's been this post-colonial turn and this post-colonial critique of urban studies, still we have a lot of knowledge about how cities of the North work. But then in development studies, we have a lot of knowledge about how cities of the South work. Not so much city, because development studies has often been framed around rural questions, but I think there's still a lot of issues about urban and the connection between urban and rural in development studies. So I think that by bringing together urban studies and development studies, then we can have a better conversation about how cities of the Global South work. And the other question of relational comparisons is another thing that I am interested in, and I'm working on a paper on this right now, which is how to do comparisons in a different way, in a way that it's not just comparing South-South cities, which I think this has been done, or we are doing that, but it's also how do we think about similarities, about processes. And I think that's what the policy, mobilities, and transfer literature does very well, which is taking cities not as cases, but as nodes, right? So what you're interested is in understanding the process, and you can compare processes. You can compare, for example, processes by which Bogota was made as a model and Porto Alegre was made as a model. And what that's comparing, not Bogota and Porto Alegre, but the making of Bogota and Porto Alegre as world models. What comparing those processes, what does that tell you about changes that are happening in the world right now? I think that's a very interesting approach to me, taking cities as nodes rather than cases. And finally, there's some ethical questions in my research of philanthropy, obviously, because philanthropy, part of the power of philanthropy is having these experts, right, about urban planning, about development. So those experts are in the universities that we work on, right? So I think that's a very interesting about how can we use philanthropy in a way that respond to our interests, as opposed to philanthropy using us as a way to spread particular models around the world. And I think I'm going to leave it there. I think I had some questions about the new research that I'm working on, but I think maybe I can tell about this in the presentation in the next panel, which I'm going to be presenting that research. So I'm sure, and then we can maybe discuss this paper, which I think has a lot of things to be discussed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Your presentation was much appreciated. I'm Giancarlo Cotella from Politecnico di Torino, and welcome to everybody also from my side. And I think it's now time to use the distinguished speaker that we have in this pitches presentation session now to kick off the discussion concerning the topic that is being raised by Sergio. And I would like to organize this in 2 rounds of statements from the 4 speakers that we have, and focusing each of these rounds on one topic that has been already raised by Marcin Dąbrowski and then by Sergio in his conclusion. And I would like the first pitch presentation, the first pitch statement from our guest to be focused exactly on this idea of urban solutionism, urban success, and leveraging city. And how does this approach that since some 10-year time and even more in the last years has been taking more and more importance in the field of urban studies is actually affecting urban and regional studies. So the idea that cities are the engine for development, they are the solution for development and so on and so forth. And the fact that this is bringing to good practices to be individuated and delivered from cities to cities and so on and so forth, how much is this affecting how development works and how we study development, how the field of urban and regional studies is working. And this is what I would like to answer in the first place. Then I anticipate now the second question that I will remark again later, and is more linked to the last ethical doubt that Sergio brought forward. What is our role as academics and planners, and both academic and planner, depending where we are, in this field? Because as Sergio says, sometimes we do work for these organizations, sometimes we do consultancy for them, sometimes we study them, and sometimes even if we don't work for them, we study them getting financed by their money. So it is a quite a dilemma also from my side, because I really see it, and not only in relation to this global philanthropy organization, but also in relation to research funding that we get to many different organizations, also in the global north, I would say. So I think these doubts has to be somehow explored a bit more in detail. But I would like to start with the first question about leveraging city and urban solutionism, and giving the floor to Roberto Rocco from TU Delft. I would give the floor to every speaker for around 3 minutes for each round, if we want to keep the timing. And I also ask to all the audience, if you have any question, to start to writing it in the chat, so that then after these 4+4 pitches, we have time for opening the floor for a discussion also between the speakers and the audience. Thanks a lot. Please, Roberto.
Hi, everyone. My name is Roberto. I'm an associate professor of spatial planning and strategy, and I'll speak very fast since I have only 3 minutes. Thanks, Sergio, for telling us about this, how philanthropy is shaping public policy around the world. That's a super interesting topic that tells us about how philanthropy is bypassing the machinery of representative democracy to shape public opinion, right? And I think that's very, very dangerous. And I think that maybe we should try to investigate more about urban solutionism and the fixation of certain quarters about, for example, the smart city or smart solutions and technology in order to depoliticize the discussion on development. Attached to that, I would like you to reflect on what is the role of us urban planners in Latin America, for example, when we are mostly from the white middle class that doesn't have really an attachment and an understanding of how people actually live. This is a very provocative question.
Thank you, Roberto. I will move to the next speaker, and then in the end, in the end of this first 4, I will leave Sergio maybe 2 minutes to reply. And now we have Andrea Carrion from Flaxo, Ecuador. Please, Andrea.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Giancarlo, for organizing this conversation. And to Sergio for his presentation. I'm particularly interested in your on how you address this idea of a socially constructed mythical narrative of success, especially through your paper, and how policy options are labeled as good and best practices that thereafter become a quick fix to particular problems, sometimes avoiding structural factors. But also how this global philanthropy and multilateral organizations or financing institutions are given some overemphasis to some instruments as the guidelines or the toolbox or the lineamientos de acción in different levels that can thereafter be replicated by other cities, and with a certain dismissal of what Elinor Ostrom will call the policy arena as a field of action that can shape how those policies are actually implemented. In that regard, I have 2 related questions to motivate the debate. And to what extent urban policy solutions that are being transferred portray mainly metropolitan cities or large cities, and what are the difference between this sort of global cities then can irradiate some solutions to intermediate in small cities as well. And on the other side, on the flip side, how these voluntary standards and measures taken by certain cities are thereafter replicated through transnational city networks such as Ciclovia or UCLG. But once they become normalized or ruled out through more formal institutional frameworks, they are not quite embedded, and thereafter there's some certain clash because they are not voluntary anymore. So they become enforced through regulations that can later be contested by the same cities as well. So when we are talking from the climate change framework and certain countries are going forward into the NDCs, the national determined contributions, those best practice that become now policy frameworks in a more normative stance, show some contention, some clash. And maybe I leave it to there because I'm also concerned on how this pandemic has increased urban solutionism, especially in relation with public transit and public spaces.
Thank you very much, Andrea. That's a concern that also strikes me, because I've been seeing in the last 6 or 7 months quite much of this urban solutionism idea coming out of the rationale brought forward by the pandemic. But I will now give the floor to Ryan Whitney from the University of Toronto to read his opinion about the topic that has been discussed. Please, Ryan.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Sergio, for your presentation, and for everybody for having me today. So I find what was presented very interesting, and I think it's extremely important currently in our urbanistic dialogue. So I'm based in Mexico City, and I actively see how Mexico City is constructing itself as one of these models, and all of the different international organizations that are actively involved in providing money and kind of creating these investments in sustainable transportation. So everything from bike lanes to pedestrian streets to pop-up parks to BRT. These are all models that were specifically pushed and built in Mexico City through these connections to larger international organizations and through a variety of different sources. So one question that really jumps up to me is kind of, I'm very interested in the actors that are involved in this within the local context, and how this relates to specific equity questions, also to questions of privilege. So for example, race, class, educational institutions. A lot of times, both in Toronto and in Mexico City, where I work a lot, the actors that are pushing these policies come from very specific universities, and they come from very specific backgrounds, and they come from very privileged backgrounds that allows them to connect to these larger international networks and push forward these issues. So I'm very interested in how kind of the larger educational system, for example, perpetuates these best practices and these connections to very elite forms of knowledge that in many ways are rebuilding our cities in one way you could argue more equitable, more sustainable for a very specific subset of the population. But it's also reproducing in many ways socioeconomic stratification and racial stratification in our cities, not just in Latin America where I'm working currently, but certainly in cities in Canada. I also notice this, and the way it plays out is very different. But the fact remains that it's a very specific person that's pushing forward these dialogues, and it's a very specific person that is benefiting from the implementation of these different policies and programs. So I would like to hear a little bit of reflection on how these kind of trends and these larger best practices are perpetuated specifically by specific within cities, and how this relates to their access to specific educational opportunities, and how this relates back to their class within the societies in which they're working. So I'd be interested in talking and hearing a little bit more about that, but thank you very much for the presentation, and it's wonderful to see.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. And before giving the word for some reaction to Sergio, I will still give the floor to Francesca Blanc from Politecnico di Torino.
Thank you, Giancarlo, and thank you, Sergio, for your presentation. Actually, it's one of my favorite papers, also for the approach you use and kind of writing approach you have. Actually, my point of view is both from practitioner and academic, because I am currently involved in PhD studies, but mainly I come from the practices with the practice with local governments. So maybe it's much related to that part from practitioner. And I think that the narrative of the urban success in many local governments here in Europe, but also in Latin America and Africa, is related with the urban SDG, which is the SDG 11. And for many of them, it's like a panacea. So implementing the SDG 11 in their territories, it means to resolve many different problems. And it is fine because we know that cities are now looked at like problems and at the same time as solutions. No? But in this sense, the risk of the urban solutionism, as you call it, is like focusing only on problem solving rather than on problem setting. And I think in the following part of the workshop with Giovanni Vecchio, we will discuss it. And I don't know, from local governments, many times the focus is on policies coming from abroad, like a quick fix solution, but they just look at the solution in political terms. So as planners and also as academics, it is important to highlight how this has to be looked at not only in political terms, of course, no? And maybe after with Roberto, we can deepen in the discussion with the social justice framework, because I think it is important from our point of view as academics and practitioners to share the power relationship behind transfer of policies and also in implementing policies coming from abroad, but always highlighting the social problems behind that and focusing on social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. I think there is already quite a lot of meat on the stove, so that Sergio can maybe take some time to react to the input that has been given in relation to his work. Please, Sergio.
Yes, okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, these are all important questions. These are questions that I've been also thinking a lot lately, because, and I mean, it's a pity I couldn't present sort of like where my new work is going, but I think these questions actually are perfect for me to explain part of this new work and how that new work builds on this research that I presented. So I think there's a very interesting question that Roberto posed, and I think it's connected with what Ryan's said also about privilege, which is, yeah, what is the role of planners in Latin America? And I think that is, and how is that connected with privilege, right? So, so I think that is a very interesting, something that is interesting, because something that I did not said that much, and I didn't write that much in that paper, but to me it's obvious, but maybe it's not so obvious for many people, is the connection of planners with this apparatus of global philanthropy and the World Bank, right? So in a way, planners, and I teach urban planning at the Universidad de los Andes, which is one of the elite universities in Colombia and Latin America. So I teach the planners that are then going to take over. And some of these planners actually have studied abroad also. Like, it's also very easy. So probably it's the same in other Latin American countries, like people that go to study in the US, they have their degrees in MIT or NYU or Berkeley or whatever, and then they come back to Colombia to take positions of power. And actually that's what basically legitimates their expertise, having studied abroad. And while they study abroad, they connect with, they learn English, they connect with all these networks of global philanthropy and the World Bank. And so when they come back to Latin America, they are sometimes, as Ryan said, and I think Ryan's thesis has very much showed that, sometimes they're more connected with these global networks than with their own, with the citizens of these cities, especially with the citizens that are living in peripheral areas, which are basically the citizens that need more planning. So that is a very interesting question to me, and that's a question that needs to be addressed, because it's not so much, and I hope that my paper is not read as, oh, this is the story, the traditional story of the North, some like bad people in Washington DC like plotting everything, right? So this is very the way that this power operates is that these global networks that are based on the North are connected to the South through planners and through mayors and through these kind of people. So this means that in order to change that, not only we need to change global philanthropy or how the international development apparatus work, but also we need to change the ways in which planners respond to citizens rather than to these networks, right? So that is a key question. we don't have there's no easy answer, but there's a lot of room for action, I think, here, which means starting from the way that we educate planners to the way that planning operates in Latin. And that is connected with this new research project that I'm working on, which is how, and it's very much connected with this idea of, do we need new laws then? Do we need a new constitution? Do we need a new law? And I would say for Chile, for instance, probably yes, they need a new constitution. But in the case of Colombia, it's not that we have actually very progressive laws already. If you read the Colombian new constitution from 1991, or if you read Law 388, which I know that Francesca has done research about that, you see that it's very progressive, but it's basically based on urban reform movements that happened in Brazil and Latin America in the 80s and 90s. So we have actually very progressive legal frameworks. But the problem is that those legal frameworks are not being implemented. And partly is because of these networks that are connecting us or connecting planners to like whatever hot new idea is happening. But I think that to me, the key question, and that is also part of my new work, is about how do we ensure that these progressive frameworks, progressive legal frameworks that we have in Latin America or in many countries in Latin America, and that we're now probably going to have in Chile too, are actually implemented. And that means a new role of the planner, I think. And I think that means that we need a planner that actually experiments with needs, problems of the territory, of cities, and then apply new ways of solving those problems. And the problem with urban solutionism is that you sort of like have the answer for the question rather than ask the question, right? So you have the solution already. Like, so sometimes the question becomes to how to implement it. So the people from Bloomberg Philanthropies come to Bogota and convince all the planners that we need to do this because this is what we need to do. And then the question becomes, how do we do this? How do we implement this solution in Bogota? How do we adapt it? And I think that's part of the problem, right? So we need instead is to be asking, what is that people in Bogota are telling us to do? Or what are people like needing, what they need? And I think that implies a figure of the planner that is not an expert in a way that, oh, yes, I am an expert, I know everything. Rather, it's like to train planners in forms of advocacy. I mean, I'm very interested in this idea of, that was actually from the 60s in the US, of the idea of advocacy planning, right? So the idea that when planners were not working for the government, but were actually working for particular groups. So particular groups where particular community groups hire a planner in order to defend their interest. And I think there's something about...
Just, sorry to interrupt. Don't you think that there is a huge responsibility from education in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, to cater to what you're saying? Because yes, our education is completely related to these international circuits that you were mentioning, and yes, not to the real problems on the ground.
Yes, I completely agree. And that's what and I think that part of us, a lot of us that are here, at least, we're not just researchers, we're also professors or teachers probably in urban planning schools. So I think that there's two things. One is that planning cannot be tied to architecture. That's like a traditional approach that has been happening, I think. And that's the one thing that I'm very interested in, why I took this job where I work now at FIDER, is that we have one of the first urban planning programs that is not based on an architecture school. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to take out the program from the architecture school, but it means that it's a different way of teaching planning. This is not just like a technical issue, but it's also a way of how do you develop those soft, how it's called, habilidades blandas in Spanish, soft skills, right? Things like empathy, things like how to listen, things like participation. Those are key questions. But I think that also we cannot put all the responsibility on planners themselves, but actually on how to empower the communities, right? So the planner is not like the God that is going to save everything, right? It's actually the communities that know what they need. How do we, how are we able to make them hire a planner to achieve what they want to do? I think that's one of the key questions. I mean, I could elaborate this on forever, but I want to move on to other questions.
Yeah, I will just kick off a second round of panel intervention, and then open the discussion open the floor to everybody. So please, Roberto, if you still have some argument, or I can move on. Up to you.
Well, I think we covered quite a lot of ground in the first round of questions. I'm particularly interested in this connection between that Ryan was talking about, between the elites and the planning that happens on the ground, including the informal kind of urban planning that we have, and how all this urban solutionism is not incorporating any of the simple solutions that people have on their daily lives, planning the city informally or building the city informally. So maybe we could discuss a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Roberto. And Andrea, please.
Yeah, I am quite keen to the introduction to your paper that provides a more personal account on how you act, and every of us here today act sometimes as part of this set of global policy entrepreneurs. But I would also like to retrieve the idea of Walter Benjamin of the flaneur, the idea of the voyeurism, the idea that we are as spectators of this policies changes and sets of policy instruments. In some cases was well informed, but also sometimes only as recipients then thereafter replicate. So while through your paper you express how many field trips were done to Bogota, there might be some other cases where the copy of the policy tool is made only through paperwork, or not with actual learning from the cities or the policymakers in the ground. And that is quite risky, I will say. So maybe you can elaborate on what is our role in disseminating these best practices, or through documentation and systematization, and how that gets to a third, fourth, or second round of policymakers.
Thank you, Andrea. I think this point is quite close to one of the questions that has been posed in our chat from Pablo Munoz Uncheta about how can academia support changing this logic of transferable, easy and replicable solution. And I will give the floor to Ryan now.
Yes, hi. So a few comments. So Sergio, I find it really interesting, your idea from advocacy planning from the US from the 1960s. I've been thinking a lot about this too, specifically within the context of Latin America, and me as myself, positioning myself, a white man working in Latin America, coming from Canada, having a PhD from Canada. And I work for a lot of the international organizations through consulting. And in order to kind of gain notary or power within those larger networks, I also have to reference these best practices because it's the expectation of what you do as a planner. So then I struggle a lot with kind of challenging these expectations while also creating more equitable outcomes. And something that comes to mind, specifically when you mentioned how planners respond to citizens. And I think that is so key. Because there's this lot of, I would argue too, that participatory planning more generally has also become part of the larger kind of global dialogue of what we need to be doing as planners in order to create better outcomes, more sustainable outcomes, more equitable outcomes. But I would also argue that it's not working, specifically too within the context of Latin America. So we have these large international organizations now in many cases that require stakeholder engagement, that require participatory planning, that technically require planners to talk to marginalized communities or to speak to other communities to gain their feedback, but it's not working. There isn't a loop that actually allows that feedback to challenge policy. And in many cases, the people who are working as planners and in positions of power are so disconnected from the realities of those people that there's very few opportunities for dialogue. And in many cases, I find that best practices are used as an entrance into those communities to try to prove the importance of these strategies and of these approaches. So I'm very interested in this question about, for instance, kind of planners working more for communities as opposed to working for governments or international organizations, and how that connects to larger issues of participatory planning, because there's a ton of academic research now that challenges participatory planning as even functioning within these spaces. And also it challenges in a way if communities can even be assumed to be democratic. Like if we're going into these communities and we're asking for people's opinions, there are power struggles within communities and between different groups. So can we even assume that the ideas that are being brought forward by communities are necessarily the best for the communities, or who has voice, who has power within those communities themselves? So I'm very interested in that connection between participatory planning and this idea that you presented of more advocacy planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. And Francesca, before we give back the floor to Sergio.
Just to answering the provocation of do we need more progressive legal frameworks in Latin America? I don't think so. For example, the Ecuadorian constitution of 2008 or the new spatial planning law, they are actually really progressive legal bodies. But the problem is how are they implemented? And reading your work, Sergio, on and references to the 1991 Colombian Constitution and to the 388 law of 1997, it's just like seeing something already happened in Colombia and now happening in Ecuador. No? So we have progressive legal frameworks, but for example, the issue of the right to the city is already included in the Ecuadorian constitution and spatial planning law, but it has been included like a mantra, as someone said, and circulating also in Latin America, but the issue is how it has been implemented. And in this sense, you also refers to, I think, community planners. No? Our role as planners and practitioners, not only working for UN Habitat or working for different international organizations, but why not working for communities? And I think the only one case I saw in my professional experience was in the city of Barcelona in Catalonia, and knowing people, planners like me, working for communities. But here in Italy, for example, it's not so easy, because if you want to do that, it's like volunteer work, so it's difficult because you have to receive some money from your activity. And maybe this role of community planners could be introduced through the academia. So explaining how, of course, the fact of having funds is also important, but maybe introducing this role of community planner is important. And another thing, as academics, but also as practitioners, using best practices, not from capital cities, but maybe from small, medium, and from small, medium cities, and also from peripheries. It could be interesting for changing this global discourse on urban solutionism and quick fix solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. We'll give the floor back to Sergio for reacting. I think many of the comments that we are receiving on the chat are on the same line, meaning they highlight this hiatus between legal framework and the constitutional framework that is there and is progressive and has inside itself the potentials for making a difference on what are the practices implemented on the ground and the actual practice on the ground that don't follow it, don't manage to get attached to it. And this is readable from what Pablo Munes Unceta is writing on the chat and also Patricia Urqueta or Gabriel Silvestre. So if you want in your reaction also to take some of this comment. And then there are some more specific questions also on the chat. There is one from Ana Maria Fernandez Maldonado about why the solution from Bogota has been taken roots as a best practice, while the one from Curitiba from the 70s is not to the same extent. Please, Sergio.
Great, thank you. These are all very provocative and interesting questions and get me thinking a lot about new research things, agendas we need to do, not only on research, but also on planning, or rethinking planning. But I wanted to focus on the questions of Andrea and Francesca, because I think I focused too much on Roberto's and Ryan's in the earlier round. So, because there's a question that Andrea posed before that I think is very interesting, which is about the construction of success, of the narratives of success. And I think that like sometimes my work is read as like a critique of best practices, and it is. But it also, I think there's something powerful about best practices that is something powerful about learning, right? So the good thing, I would say that the good thing about best practices is that it sort of like makes it easier to learn what's going on, right? So if you talk about BRT from a very technical perspective, like an engineer, normally transportation experts have been very dry and have been very sort of like focused on the numbers and on the, but I think what the story of Bogota, what made it is that it made buses something that was easily understandable by many people, no? So I think that is the power of best practices. And there's this paper from this Italian researcher called Laura Lieto, and she tells about how when a policy travels, what travels is not the policy, is a myth about the policy, a myth of success about that policy. That's what makes a policy travel, that you have a story of success somewhere, be it Bogota, be it Porto Alegre, be it Curitiba, whatever, that allows for your policy to move. So the construction of those myths and those narratives of success are very important in the circulation of knowledge. Now, I've studied that in the context of Bogota and in the context of BRT and bicycle policies, but one could also use the power of those narratives to diffuse or to transfer other kinds of knowledges, right? So that is also, we cannot forget. So the problem in a way is not like, oh, we cannot like refer to best practices. Is what kind of best practices are we using? Is the best practices that global philanthropy wants because they allow them to reach their year goals? Or is it the narratives of other peoples that we want to use? So in that way, rural learning, and also addressing another question of Andrea, which was, is this a big cities thing? Is this like big cities sharing best practices? And I would say, no, there's like a long tradition of rural learning. And actually one of the first work in the literature of policy diffusion is a book called Diffusion of Innovations. And this book, Diffusion of Innovations in the 60s, it was about the rural technologies that were transferred to other rural areas. So there's been a lot of things in rural areas, and there's also a very powerful mechanism of rural transmission of knowledge, which is when peasants travel from one place to another to learn from other peasants, right? So that's a very, like rural community planners have used that technique for a long time now. And so I think that's also something that we can learn. So it's not so much about not using best practices or not using narratives. It's actually, for me, understanding the power of narratives and best practices and to then apply to other kind of actors, right? And that's what connects with the question of Francesca, which is, and the question of Ryan in a way, which is, okay, then how do we use these narratives or these best practices diffusion for empower or to move the knowledge that people in communities need or solve? And I think that to me is an interesting question. And I would say, imagine if we could use all that funding from philanthropy, because that question of Francesca is also very relevant. Like, yes, this is great that planners would work as advocates for communities, but then who pays for that, right? Can you imagine, sometimes I imagine, like, what if all this philanthropic funding would go to actually fund that instead of imposing their best practices, to fund planners working for communities, to let communities identify what they need and what they want to move. So I think that, yes, the issue of funding is always central, but I think that what if we could move part of that money that is going now to these global networks to actually hiring planners to work for particular communities. And I think that is what it would allow to, and there's some interesting exercises of that happening in Bogota, of planners working for communities that are actually trying to translate this progressive legal framework, because that's the other key question for me also. Like how we do, it's not a question of coming with new legal frameworks, it's how do we translate those legal frameworks into outcomes, into progressive outcomes. And I think that has to do with that you need lawyers. That's also the other thing about that I've been recognizing lately, is that it's not that we need planners only, it's that we need either lawyers or planners that know how to experiment with these legal frameworks, because that is very important. How to translate these progressive legal things that are in many countries, in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Brazil, how do we translate it into particular urban planning projects? Because what we see is a very worrying gap between the laws, the legal frameworks, and what is actually implemented on the ground. Or Mexico City, that has now the right to the city, it's completely internalized. But then how do we do that? And we need legal experimentation for that. So we need, I think, also another question that I've been dealing with is that we need to train planners in law, in legal instruments and stuff like that. But the other thing is how to use narratives. And I want to very quickly share this idea that I'm doing in my university. I'm trying to come up with a lab, even though labs are also very problematic, as Ryan knows. But I'm coming with this idea of an urban narratives lab, which is the idea of how do we create new narratives about the city, and how do we tell different stories about the city, and how do we use the power of narratives to tell other stories about the city. And I think that's also something that planners need to learn. And I hope that my students could also then not just write their master thesis, but also try to understand the importance of like creating certain narratives and how those narratives can change eventually the way that planning is done.
Thank you, Sergio. I see there are some reaction. I mean, the discussion has been already kicked off, so I would say the floor is open for everyone that would like to intervene. And I see there are two comments, reaction to your argument by Gabriel Silvestre. If Gabriel would like to present his view on that, maybe he could turn on the microphone and do it himself, so that we have more dialogue instead of just writing now.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. No, thanks a lot. Yeah, no, these are all very good questions, and I thank Sergio for putting them to the floor. It's also something that I'm dealing right now with the work that I do, this immense gap between what are there on the constitutions and on plans and the big gap there exists to implementation. But I was wondering if this constant need for, let's say, progressive actors, let's just call this, to come up with a solution, to come up with new ways to change the inequalities in the cities, we will now not be repeating things that we might have done already, which is seeing best practices, good idea, that then, because of the asymmetries in terms of funding, asymmetries in terms of power, can easily be co-opted by, for instance, institutions or actors who are well positioned to make use of this kind of new frameworks to serve their own interests. And I'm thinking here, for instance, on the experience of participatory budgeting and how the World Bank became the main, let's say, funder and disseminator of that practice after depoliticizing, let's say, the radical premise in which it was based. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. There was also a comment from Claudio Sarmiento Casas. If Claudio would like to take the floor and present his comment himself. I also highlight the attention of everybody online with us on a couple of links that Laura Choconta linked in our chat. So maybe you want to save it for later.
Yeah, sure.
Claudio?
Hi everyone. Yeah, I can chime in on my comment. I was thinking on Sergio's comments on how which narratives are actually moved throughout international philanthropies, and I was thinking that I think one of the most enticing narratives is the fact that the South is able to make these drastic changes. So I was thinking about Medellin, how one of the main narratives is that it previously was one of the most insecure and dangerous cities, and now is one of the most socially progressive ones. And I think this also connects with the fact that those narratives are particularly salient with topics of global topics that know no borders, like climate change and water basins, for example, that can transcend borders. So that international philanthropy is justified in trying to incite this change and incite these success stories in the global south rather than locally. So it's not a question, it's just a thought. That's why I put it in the chat. So maybe it helps the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Claudio. And is there any reaction? Laura was raising his hand. Please, Laura.
Hi.
But just don't raise only the hand, because I see only few people on the screen. So it's better if people also write their name again on if they want to talk, because I don't see all of you on my screen.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. I hope that you can hear me at least.
Yes.
I have class now and I have to change then.
It's okay.
Actually, I wanted to share these two links because they introduced me to very interesting discussions about how in international cooperation and international relationships, North-South partners are going through learning processes. And this includes, well, I applied in my thesis on how regional cooperation can also lead to regional development. But I think it sets a lot of questions on how we can, ethically revise how this cooperation and international relationships can also lead to different changes, including policy transfers. So I just wanted to share it in case somebody's interested in giving it a look, because it can get extensive, the discussion. So
Thank you very much, Laura. And if there is not any immediate comment, I would give again the floor either to Sergio or to one of the other speakers if they want to react to what has been raised. Just turn on the microphone if you're interested in.
Okay, I can respond. So this, again, very interesting thoughts. I've been also reading the chat. There's also very interesting ideas. I think there's this gap, this question of this gap between the legal framework and the constitutions and how planning is done on the ground. I think is very interesting, especially because of Chile. I think that this Chilean decision election or referendum yesterday was very interesting, because we are always very hopeful when we see like new laws coming, new right to the whatever, right to the city, right to housing, right to something, and we're always very excited about that. And I think that is important, that it's inscribed in the constitution or in the big legal frameworks of each country. But I think also the experience of many countries in Latin America tell us now that there's now the question of how, which I think is very much what we are discussing here, is like questions about how we do this are become very important. And one of the answers for that question is this idea of like, oh, how do you do it? Well, here are the solutions. No, here are like what you should do, and that's the easy path. But we also see how problematic that is. And I think that I agree with Gabriel that there's always the risk of co-optation of when we rely on development funding or philanthropic funding. But to me, it's a big question. It's like, who is going to pay for this? Who's going to pay for these planners, or who's going to pay for this knowledge? Maybe it doesn't need to be planners, but it has to be, even if we empower directly the community, let's say training them, in some legal aspects in order to reclaim their rights. Who's going to pay for that? And I think the question to me is like, it comes either from the state, which actually is the one that should be doing it, but we also know that if the state is funding planners, then planners are going to be responding to the state, which not necessarily mean that it's responding to the needs of communities, but or then is funded by some sort of like philanthropic funding, which then has the risk of co-optation. So I don't know. To me, it's a very tricky question, but it's a question that we will need at some point to respond, or maybe we need some sort of like the state channeling funds from other sources, or to pay for like planning programs for community members, leaders. I don't know, but I think that there's something interesting about this idea to me of like especially in Latin America these days, of planners experimenting with legal frameworks to actually advance those those progressive and inclusive outcomes. But the other question that and thank you, Laura, for that link. I think that's a very interesting ethical questions about this North-South. But I also think that one of the things that this paper that I presented does to me is that sometimes these North-South divisions is not so much important as to who are the actors and interests that are being empowered or not. Because again, we can have this idea of North-South, but then in the South is these sort of like elite actors that are aligning themselves with North agenda. So even though we are using, you know, South knowledge, in a way it's like whose knowledge is that, no? Or whose interests are those? And so I think that it's interesting to understand these ideas of North-South, but it's also interesting to go deeper as to who are the actors in the South and in the North that are empowered by these circulations of knowledge, and how to create narratives. How do we use narratives in another way? Or how do we use solution and best practices for other kind of actors, right? Also, and again, in a way, not demonizing best practices or narratives of success, but rather problematizing who gets to use them, what kind of interests and agenda are advancing those narratives. Because narratives is I think that's also the interesting thing, that planning need to be, that is one of the soft skills that planners need to learn, is how to use narratives in order to change planning. So it's not the problem with narratives of best practices, the problem is with what are the agendas and interests behind those best practices.
Thank you, Sergio. Andreas is raising his hand, I can see him. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Giancarlo, yes. Well, let me first of all say I have practically no right to speak in this company. I've never been to the Global South. I have been to the Global South, but I've never worked in the Global South, and I have sort of no first-hand experience. But let me share with you an observation. I mean, there's this surprising result that billionaire donors have a large influence. And there's unease about this, because why? Well, it's not democratic. Huh? Actually, Roberto was articulating this. He said, well, how about a representative democracy? Now, you know, in my view of things, representative democracy is not a gold standard. It is not a standard which we can identify very clearly, and we cannot raise to the Olympic heights of a global standard. I give you an example from which happens to involve representative democracy and a donor, George Soros. He has funded the Central European University, and now he has been kicked out. Now the regime, the Orban regime, is democratically legitimized. It is representative, at least by in the way in which we certify representative democracy elections. There's absolutely no doubt that he has won 3 elections, one after the other. Yeah? And so he is entitled to throw Soros out and the Central European University out. And I believe that this is happening the world over. It's happening in South America. Huh? I mean, Chavez was democratically legitimized, yes? So without having any first-hand knowledge of this, I want to point out to you this dilemma. It's inherent to the whole discussion. So you are talking a lot about privilege. You are talking a lot about the privilege which people from the Global South who have been educated in the North have, and then go back. Not that I have a solution to this, but I want to point to you that it is something that is underlying the whole discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you, Andreas, for your comment. Yeah, that I absolutely agree. And that's why I also was very careful to say, when we're talking about this shift in international development towards, you know, toward global philanthropy having more power, I hope I was very careful to not say that the previous regime was working perfectly, right? Because even though before was governments, democratically elected governments of the North, basically Europe and North America, deciding what the World Bank should do or should not do. Obviously, that was not either. We have plenty of critiques of that in the development studies literature that show us how that kind of apparatus of development also was not working, even though it was democratically elected the countries that were funding them, right? So I think that, yeah, I wouldn't say that we cannot romanticize a previous state, especially in Latin America, because there was it's not like, that's why also the discussions about neoliberalism in Latin America are always different, because it's not like we have a welfare state before where we are moving on to now a neoliberal state. It's actually that welfare state never existed in the first place. So rather, that's why I like talking more about this idea of experimenting, because I think that is the phase in what we are now, that we need to experiment with different forms of state configurations, because the state, and the other question is that the state planners working for the state in Latin America are also not a warranty that things are going to happen, even though we have all these progressive legal frameworks that we've been talking about. Because I think that rather what we see in Latin America is these experiments of democratization, neoliberalization, decentralization. There's all these things that have been happening in the last 2 decades. And I think that exciting things are happening, but also like all logics also prevail. No? So that's why I like very much the language of experimenting, because I think that's the moment in which we are in Latin America. But I don't think we have very solid references of how this should be done, neither from the past or from other places, because then we will be assuming these ideas that whatever happened in Europe is what we should do, which is also very problematic, as we've seen.
Thank you, Sergio. Is there any other intervention? I saw Roberto posted a comment about the institutional capacity of a smaller unit, yeah, which is quite interesting. I think this is very relevant in relation to this urban solutionism thing, because you are presenting good practices that travel from one big place to another big place, but what happens in smaller place, who take care of them? And here we're still talking about small cities, but what about in places that don't have any decent sized city in the neighborhood, and this is something that is not only discussion in the global south. It's been also in Europe in the last year, where a lot of attention has been put on cities as the engine for development, and in some places what happened outside cities is somehow getting in the background, and this is according to me is dangerous a bit, and anyway it overshadows a part of urban and regional studies. So I think this is relevant.
Yeah, I think that's the question that many people have posed and I haven't responded yet. I think Andrea did it in the beginning, then Francesca, then Roberto in the chat, which is the role of small and medium-sized cities. And I would say, as I said briefly before, I wouldn't say this is just a question of big cities sharing best practices. As I said, there's also a long tradition in the diffusion and transfer literature about rural cases, so rural transfer of knowledge. But I think that what is true is that what we don't have a lot of knowledge of circulation is small and medium-sized cities. So we have the big cities sharing, things like C40 and big fora on cities, Davos, like all that is like, oh, but what is Bogota doing? What is London doing? What is like Hong Kong doing? Like we have a lot of channels for big cities, but we also have in the development circuits, we have a lot of channels for rural policies or rural mechanisms, but it's true that we don't have so many channels for small and medium-sized cities. And what happened with small and medium-sized cities is that either if they're small, then they are sort of like framed as rural, which does not apply, or if they are bigger, then they are looking at really big cities, which also that do not apply. So I think that and I've written about this. We did an edited book. It's called Fragile Governance and Local Economic Development, where we looked at small and medium-sized cities in Latin America to sort of like trying to understand also, especially like what kind of things work on those cities that can apply to each other. Because I think that's a big question in urban studies, is how do we bridge not only how we look at cities of the South, which is the more traditional post-colonial critique, but then when we look at cities of the South, then we have the experience of Mexico City, of Bogota, of like Buenos Aires, no? But then how do we understand the logics that are taking place in small and medium-sized cities and their connection between big cities and rural areas? I think that's a very important question that I think we will need to take more seriously, because, and I know that in Europe they're also starting to ask that question, and I think in Latin America it's also urgent, that agenda, because actually it's the majority. I don't have it here, but I have a graph where you show, there's also this idea of like, 80% of people in Latin America live in cities, and then immediately one's imagining Sao Paulo, Mexico City, like Bogota, big cities. But the reality is that 80% of urban population mostly lives in small and medium-sized cities. And I don't have the graph here now, but I know that graph exists. And so we're not putting that much attention on that, and I think we should.
Thanks a lot. Oh, there is another comment from Vladislav Timinsky. Sergio, that's for you, I think. If you could elaborate on the proposal of taking cities as nodes, not cases.
Yes, as I said, I'm actually writing an article about this. We just sent it to a journal. Hopefully it will be published, together with Gianpaolo Baiocchi, who is a sociologist who has written a lot about the making of Porto Alegre and participatory budgeting as a model too. So we did compare the making of Bogota as a model with the making of Porto Alegre as a model. And we have some methodology. It's more of a methodological article. So hopefully, I'm happy to send, if you contact me by mail, I can write my email here. I can send you the draft to anyone who's interested. It's not published yet. Hopefully it'll be published soon. Sorry, I send it only to Giancarlo. Everyone there. So that is to me also very interesting. How do we compare processes, right? Not just cities. And so when we compare processes, then things about what are happening in the world start to happen, right? So what I think is interesting about this paper that I presented is that, yes, I write about Bogota, but really my conclusion is a bigger point about the international development apparatus. And I think that's the point that we need more for those of us writing about and from the global South, is how do we make our case that our research is not just about cases. No, it's not just about, the empirical case of Bogota, what happened in Bogota, but the theory remains in the North, or the big, or like things about the big world remains for researchers based in the North. Like with this article, I talk about Bogota, but I'm trying to make Bogota a node of a bigger circulation, a bigger shift that is happening in the international development apparatus. And that, even though this paper is not a comparison, it is in a way of using Bogota as a node to understand bigger processes. And those nodes do not have to always be in the North to talk about global things.
Well, thank you very much, Sergio. And I would say we are there. It's the first time I moderate something that ends on time. It never happened until now in like 25 years of career. So I'm very proud of myself and not only of the speaker.
Italian.
Exactly. No, I'm glad about this event, and I'm glad about seeing so many names about people that are friends from such a long time in this chat. It's just a pity that we cannot meet on person, but I really hope that also with the people that I never met on person, that will be chance to meet as soon as the health emergency is over, Yes, Marcin, is because I was not the speaker. That's why I finished on time. Thank you, Marcin, for your comment. So thanks a lot. I would like to thank Sergio once again, and Roberto, Andrea, Ryan, and Francesca for presenting us with their view and for stimulating this very interesting discussion, and to all the people that were with us for sharing their idea. So really, thank you very much for the interesting moment of conversation. I think these topics are relevant, and this is certainly not the last time that we will have a chance to discuss this together. And now I think it's time that we close this. So once again, have a nice evening. Thanks for being with us, and stay healthy.
Thank you very much to all the organizers. Yes.